Father Pavel Tarashevitz, our next speaker, has blessed our organization many times with multiple visits. He's come to the United States a lot. We've reciprocated by going to Poland a lot. He was a stalwart figure at Catholic University of Lublin for many years. He is a professor at his seminary in Mazurda, which is in northeast Poland, the seminary in Elk, Poland. He's also does great work as the editor of the Studia Gilsoniana. Many publications have emerged from this have emanated out of this very conference and have found themselves in print in Studia Gilsoniana. Father Pavel he aches for the advancement of Christian culture. So he has his background in the philosophy of culture. So does this work, by the way? Yeah. Okay. All right. Father Pavel Tarashevitz.
Thank you very much. I'm honored to have. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for choosing our session, because options were multiple. So I think I will be short, and I'm seeking to prolonging the introduction, because I must confess that as a priest, I feel uncomfortable about what I'm going to do. But on the other hand, as a philosopher, I feel an overwhelming temptation to do so. These two feelings of mine are aroused by the aim of this paper, which consists in trying to modify, to revise, to reinterpret the apostolic teaching of St. Pope John Paul II. But given, however, the fact that now he works as a saint rather than as a pope, I dare to count both on his leniency and hopefully on his blessing for my prank. Now, what in John Paul II's teaching is, in my opinion, in need to be reformed, is his apostolic letter, Inter Munera ad Academiarum, that is among the tasks of the academies, which in 1999 he addressed to his Pontifical Roman Theological Academy and the Pontifical Academy of St. Thomas Aquinas. In that letter, John Paul II bestowed upon St. Thomas Aquinas the title of Doctor Humanitatis. He wrote, I quote, "Doctor Humanitatis is the name we give St. Thomas Aquinas because he always was ready to receive the values of all cultures. In cultural conditions of our time, it seems truly appropriate to develop further this part of Thomistic doctrine, which deals with humanity, given that his assertions on the dignity of the human person and the use of his reason in perfect harmony with the faith make St. Thomas Aquinas a teacher for our time," end of quote. This passage tells those who know Latin everything they need to know. First, it says what title is given to Aquinas, Doctor Humanitatis. Second, why it is given to him, because he was always ready to receive the values of all cultures. 3, why it includes the term humanitatis, because a part of Thomistic doctrine deals with humanity. And 4, why it incorporates the term doctor, because Aquinas' timeless wisdom makes him a teacher for our time. Indeed, the Pope's utterance is coherent and self-explanatory, and seemingly leaves no place for other interpretations. Other interpretations, however, come. They come especially from those who don't know Latin, and for whom Doctor Humanitatis does not need to mean a teacher of humanity, but equally means a human doctor, a doctor of humanity, or, following the Google translator, a doctor of culture. Although linguistically incoherent and incorrect, none of these later dilettante translations is philosophically mistaken. Moreover, they seem to be more adequate than the generally accepted title, teacher of humanity. To explain this, I will try first to diagnose the disease which slowly and systematically consumes our contemporary culture, and secondly, to show that the application of Aquinas metaphysics is exactly what our culture needs to recover. First, let's listen to the facts confirming the illness of our culture. I use the excerpt, the fragment of the article by Matthew Lambs, who lists some of the large challenges we are all facing today. First, demographic. All the advanced European and Western societies, demographers indicate, are dying out. There is a birth dearth among native European populations. One needs a total fertility rate of 2.1 to maintain a population. Estimates put the rate of native populations in the European Union as averaging about 1.4. Meanwhile, the Muslims in the European Union have about 3.0 rate average. Then cultural. Intellectual fragmentation has turned universities into multiversities. Whenever schools abandon the unified integrating core in favor of the hodgepodge of unrelated majors, minors, degrees, etc. Multiculturalism poses us a guardian of diversity, but so far has been unable to avoid drab uniformity in art, architecture, media, clothes, fast food, malls, etc. the world over. Then political. Violence, war, crime, and all manner of vice are attributed to the human state of nature by empiricist human sciences. Political regimes of right and left then devise social contrasts or constitutions that formulate human rights without recognizing any power above the state. Legality is substituted for morality, as intermediate communities and institutions diminish, isolating individual citizens over against the arbitrary powers of growing federal bureaucracies. Human rights are based not upon genuine human dignity, but upon the power of interest group to get state support in the defense of their rights, legal sanctions being imposed against those who disagree. And ethical. Secularism and fundamentalism have severed virtue and the good from intelligence and have placed them solely in the will. Moral truth claims, like religious ones, are relegated to purely voluntaristic emotional options that cannot be applied to society or humanity as a whole. The moral teaching of religious institutions are seen as fundamentalist, arbitrary claims. Members and ministers of those institutions are encouraged to dissent and to teach others to do so, and also to stay in the constitutions in order to change the moral teaching. Opponents of religious institutions use scandals within the institutions to rationalize rejection of the teaching as having any moral authority. According to me, this list contains the manifestations, okay, the manifestations of the disease. Now, what is the cause of this disease? And according to John Paul II, as mentioned in his encyclical letter Fides et Ratio, the causes are as follows: the loss of faith in reason and its ability to arrive at the truth, the refusal of transcendence, nihilism, relativism, the forgetfulness of being, the denial of the soul, the prevalence of the irrational and feeling, the fear of the future, and existential anxiety. It is Pope, now myself. Okay, my diagnosis is, and I need to make it, I need to refer to Plato's allegory of chariot. In the Phaedrus, Plato uses the allegory of chariot to explain the tripartite nature of human soul. As we remember, the chariot is pulled by two winged horses, one mortal and the other immortal. The mortal horse is deformed and obstinate. Plato describes the horse as a crooked, lumbering animal, put together anyhow of a dark color with gray eyes and blood-red complexion. The mate is of insolence and pride, shag-eared and deaf, hardly yielding to whip and spur. The immortal horse, on the other hand, is noble and game, upright and cleanly made. His color is white and his eyes dark. He is a lover of honor and modesty and temperance and the follower of true glory. He needs no touch of the whip, but is guided by the word and admonition only. In the driver's seat is the charioteer, tasked with reining in these disparate steeds, guiding and harnessing them to propel the vehicle with strength and efficiency. And the charioteer, the white and dark horses symbolize one human soul and its three main components. The charioteer represents man's reason. The dark horse is appetites, and the white horse is thymos, that is spiritedness, and I would prefer to call him the will, just to close the structure of the man, reason, will, and emotions, and we have ourselves. Another way to label the three elements of the soul are as the lover of wisdom, charioteer, the lover of gain, dark horse, and the lover of victory, white horse. Aristotle described the three elements of the as the contemplative, hedonistic, and political, or knowledge, pleasure, and honor. Each element has its own motivations and desires. Reason seeks truth and knowledge. The appetite seeks food, drink, sex, and material wealth. The thymos seeks glory, honor, and recognition. Plato believed that reason has the highest aims, followed by thymos and then by appetites. But each soul force, if properly harnessed and employed, can't help a man achieve happiness. The ultimate cause of the cultural illness is an abject failure in preserving the proper harmony between reason, will, and emotions. Harmony wherein, of course, the leading role is played, according to all representatives of the classical philosophy, by the reason. Consequently, what we experience is the debilitating struggle for leadership in culture between advocates of, respectively, reason, will, and emotions. And now what we learn about from the Lublin lectures by Karol Wojtyła, the book which is about to be published in Lublin now, after so many years, 5 decades, it took to translate it into English. But what we learn is that he focused all his lectures on 3 figures: St. Thomas Aquinas, Immanuel Kant, and Max Scheler. That is why he is recognized as a student of Scheler, but he did not attend any lecture by Scheler. But it is purposeful. Thomas Aquinas, Kant, and Scheler. The advocates of the will leading find theoretical support for their claim in the philosophy of Immanuel Kant. According to Kant, what must inform any act, if it is to be a morally good act, is not the truth, but what he calls the categorical imperative, which says, act only according to the maxim by which you can will at the same time that it becomes universal law. He also states it thus: act in such a way that at any time the maxim of your will can at the same time be valid as a principle of the universal legislation. The categorical imperative has no material content, that is, no motivation by any good, such as the good expressed in the maxim, do good and avoid evil. It prescribes only the form of willing. So that is why in our society, those who advocates the leading role by the will must have the support from the side of lawyers. You know, or lawyers, or are we are lost. So this is the option for those who believe that our will is a leading power in society. The advocates of the emotions leading are supported by the philosophy of Max Scheler. According to Scheler, human action is driven by values which are the objects of certain type of feelings, whose cognitive power is to be understood as altogether detached from the cognitive power of intentional acts of consciousness. Scheler holds that the hierarchization of values and indirectly of goods is a function of pure feeling, a function of a unique kind of reflex of the emotional sphere in us, whereas rational reasons for the practical hierarchization of values, even if such reasons could be given, do not play any role. Needless to say that the social and cultural influence of the supporters of the reason as a leading power in culture is increasingly decreasing. The crisis of the reason in culture is manifested by the decline of social dialogue on values. Instead of discussing the values, what is socially and legally preferred and sought is the coexistence of values regarding as necessary condition for implementing the political idea of open society. I spent 4 weeks before coming here in Italy. Italy is flooded by immigrants from Africa, and what they observe there is that people create ghettos. They come to Italy, and instead of insert themselves into the social life with others, they prefer living by their own in communities. They are paid by the government at first to start their lives there. But anyway, it is rather coexistence of values. We lost, through the example of Italy now, we can say what we lost is the dialogue on values. What we have coexistence of different, very different values. By promoting St. Thomas Aquinas, John Paul II confirms the need to restore the leading position in culture to the reason. Also, in order to rearrange the world of human values. Human culture consists of values. By experiencing any value does not guarantee that a man lives a life worthy of man. Values worthy of man need to be truly good. And this condition cannot be satisfied unless the reason able to know the truth about the good is restored to its proper place and role. The will, promoted by Kant, then the emotions promoted by Scheler, must acknowledge their debt to the reason, capable of knowing the truth about the good. In other words, values constituting a culture worthy of man needs metaphysics to be known and recognized. Consequently, cultures need Thomas Aquinas as a doctor to be healed and recovered. One of the conclusions I inferred from the Ethics Primer, another book edited in Lublin by Wojtyła, is that there's a difference between good and value. What difference is? The difference consists in that value is experienced. We still experience something. What we experience deserves name value. That is why we differ from each other. We have a different approach even to one God's commandment. Do not kill. But we have different approaches to this. Okay, we experience this in different ways. But what we realize in our acts, through our acts in our daily life, are goods, not values. If we teach, if we transmit values worthy of realizing, we must be in agreement with reality. yes, values can refer to goods, but under one condition. They must be metaphysically justified. Okay, so that is what is needed by cultures which consist of values is metaphysics. The philosophy of St. Thomas Aquinas has endured importance because its prevailing characteristic is that it is always in search of the truth. In his commentary on Aristotle, he writes, I quote, "Philosophy is not studied in order to find out what people may have thought, but in order to discover what is true." It is written, the Cielo and Munda. The truth makes the philosophy of St. Thomas real and objective. It is a philosophy of what is, not of what appears. Now, nota bene, for ontologists, the referent of the term truth is not a real thing. For us, Professor Piotr Jaruszyński explains in his book Metaphysics or Ontology, the truth in ontology embraces the sphere of what can be thought of. The possibility of being thought of is sufficient for it to be reality. So he puts together, as I remember, such figures like Francis Suarez, like Glauberg. Glauberg is, for ontologists, a very important person because he died 1665, if I'm not mistaken. And he says that what we think of, we can divide into three, kind of beings, real beings. But it doesn't matter for ontologists. It doesn't matter that the content of my idea of a being comes from reality. No, it is being because I think of it. So it can happen that what they think of is real. Okay, it does not mean that it is their imagination which works. The other kind of being is possible being, but also what surprised me very much was that the third option is also possible. So for ontologists, even impossible being is a being, because it is possible to think of, right? Okay. But is it to be feared that favoring the philosophy of St. Thomas, one will undermine the right to exist that is enjoyed by different cultures and hinder the process of human thought? Such a fear would clearly be groundless because the methodological principle invoked above implies that whatever is real has its source in the actus essendi, and because the perennial philosophy, by reason of that principle, can claim in advance, so to speak, all that is true in regards to reality. By the same token, every understanding of reality which does in fact correspond to reality has very right to be accepted by the philosophy of being, no matter who is to be credited with such progress in understanding and to what philosophical school that person belongs. Hence, the other trends in philosophies, if regarded from this point of view, can and indeed should be treated as a natural alliance of the philosophy of St. Thomas, and as partners worthy of attention and respect in the dialogue that is carried on in the presence of reality. This is needed if truth is to be more than partial and one-sided. That is why the advice given by St. Thomas to his followers in his letter on how to study, where he said, look rather on what was said than who was that said it. Ne respicias a quo, sed quo dicitur, is so much in keeping with the spirit of his philosophy, and we can demonstrate this by showing two names used by Aquinas in his Summas. because when he mentions philosopher, he means Aristotle. When he mentions commentator, he's a Muslim philosopher, Averroes. So this is why we have to be open to different, persons speaking about reality. About reality. Why Aquinas was attracted by Aristotle? Because he was a realist. This is the, touching point. To conclude, against the background of human culture suffering from losing its contact with the truth, Thomas Aquinas appears as a qualified doctor knowing how to fight off the illness. The question is whether the modern man is aware of the disease of his culture and will want to use the medicine prescribed by the doctor of humanity. On this point, we are in debt to St. Thomas for a precise and ever valid definition of that which constitutes man's essential greatness. He has charge of himself. Ipse est sibi providens, he said in Contra Gentiles. Man is master of himself. He can make provisions for himself and form projects toward fulfilling his destiny. This fact, however, taken by itself, does not settle the question of man's greatness, nor does it guarantee that he will be able by himself to reach the full perfection of personality. And what appears here is our task, nurturing the patient, that is the man, by reminding him that the only decisive factor here is that he should let himself be guided in his actions by the truth. And truth is not made by man. He can only discover it in the nature that is given to him along with existence. Thank you very much for your patience.
Terrence Barris is a native of Wisconsin. He attended Marquette University, where he got, the degree was in history and English, right? And then he went to the University of Wisconsin-Madison and got a degree in law. He is, as we know, a stalwart worker and administrator in the vineyard of Mortimer Adler in the Center of Great Ideas. We heard from him earlier, and he's revisiting.
Well, to make up for Father, my topic will be about as narrow as his was broad. Mortimer Adler was described as a philosopher and educator and as a prolific writer and editor in his June 29, 2001 New York Times obituary. If you read his, let me get this. He wrote 2 memoirs. He lived so long. This is his second look in the rearview mirror. And if you knew who Adler was and read that second memoir, you might recall that he mentioned giving a series of annual seminars at Episcopal churches. So how did that come about? He talks about it in the book, but it's a strange place to wind up given his background. He was born in New York City to a Reformed Jewish mother and Orthodox Jewish father. He attended a Reformed synagogue with his mom and his maternal grandmother. The family observed Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, Passover and Hanukkah. For some reason, they celebrated Easter and Christmas, presumably not as religious holidays. He says in his, in the course of preparing for his bar mitzvah, he recalled quarreling with his rabbi about, the speech I was to give, but the points in contention were philosophical, not religious. This is, I believe, when he was 13. He's having a philosophical discussion with his rabbi. He characterizes his religious observance up to this point as filial, not religious piety, and his being an obedient boy. And I'm not going to keep you in suspense in this regard. This idea of, or motivation of piety does pop up from time to time and may give us some insight to what was going on here in various decisions that he made in his life. He says that in his teen years and in college, he had nothing to do with Judaism, and he began describing himself as a pagan. Now, he graduated from college when he was 20, and he started conducting great book seminars with Mark Van Doren. And around this time, he picked up his philosophical interest in God when he first started reading the treatise on God in the Summa Theologica. So in ensuing decades, he read extensively in ancient and medieval and early modern works of theology, but this was strictly for philosophical insights. When he was 24 and Helen Boynton was 20, they married. Now, she was, not the term he used, and I don't know if I've heard this before, but I'll call her a cradle Episcopalian. His parents were, he said, reconciled to that mixed marriage. He and Helen then adopted two sons, Mark and Michael, and then the sons were baptized and ultimately confirmed in the Episcopal Church. And the family attended an Episcopal church, the Church of the Redeemer in Chicago. It was near the University of Chicago campus. He says that he became friends with the rector, but the rector never tried to convert him. At least not that Adler picked up. Adler got a PhD in psychology. I think that's surprising to people if you haven't heard it before. And he entered a period from the mid-30s to 1940s where he got this deep interest in Thomism. You could call him a pagan Thomist. But the term that was applied to him, being this agnostic or pagan, so involved in Thomism, was he was called a peeping Thomist. And that was credited variously to Clare Boothe Luce or to Time magazine, but that may be a very subtle distinction at that period. But this is mid-30s to mid-40s. And at the same time, this will sound familiar, due to his dissatisfaction with modern philosophy, he was attracted to Aristotelians and Thomists. And these were generally then in the philosophy departments of Catholic universities. And they also made up most of the membership of the American Catholic Philosophical Association. He stirred up a controversy within that circle by arguing in 1939 that Aristotle and Thomas were wrong in their adverse views about democracy. And he stirred up another controversy with a 1943 essay called The Demonstration of God's Existence. In that, he argued only that Thomas had not satisfactorily proved God's existence, but it was interpreted that he was arguing that God's existence cannot be proved. The whole experience kind of soured him on what he pictured as an effort to reform, Thomism, to at least uncouple any necessary connection to Catholic theology. In other words, that Thomas's methods would be used more broadly as a means of reforming philosophy. Maybe this is editorializing. I guess I can do that. It wasn't unusual in the course of his long life that Adler would see a need for a change in some field and then embark on a comprehensive project. We are going to change everything. And then he didn't quite appreciate the scale of the undertaking. So to some extent, this was true at the University of Chicago. Robert Hutchins may have suffered from this same, I won't call it, I shouldn't call it an affliction. They aren't the only people that do this. It's not that uncommon. The Institute for Philosophical Research was another, I would say, probably an example of that, and so forth. I'll get here into a little bit then Adler and Catholicism as such. While he was at the University of Chicago, there was a issue that was raised because there were students who were studying the Thomas Aquinas in Adler's and some of the other professors' classes who were then converting to Catholicism. Now, I've heard variations of this. It was said at that time that the University of Chicago was Protestants teaching Catholic theology, no, atheists teaching Catholic theology to Jews. That was the expression. There's these variations. It gets very complicated. But one, he had to defend himself. He said, "I'm not even Catholic. I'm not trying to convert anyone to Catholicism. I'm not even a believer." So there was that. And then in turn, he was saying, well, these things that you're having these students read, get some of them to think they should become Catholic. Why aren't you Catholic? Well, he cited that, his parents were still alive. They wouldn't approve of that. His wife wouldn't approve. Their circle of friends wouldn't approve. But in his first memoir, he said, the simple truth of the matter is that I did not wish to live up to being a genuinely religious person. I could not bring myself to will what I ought to will for my whole future if I were to resolve my will at a particular moment with regard to religious conversion. But he was embarking on a series of works on the philosophical issue of the existence of God. And that went on from the mid-40s up until the end of the 70s. He said regarding this, I did not fully understand the philosophical deficiencies of what in modern times was called natural theology until fairly late in life, when I finally wrote the book I had been preparing to write for many years, How to Think About God. And that was published in 1980. It had a subtitle, A Guide for the 20th Century Pagan. Early in it, he said, a book about God written for pagans should be written by a pagan, but it should be added by one who, while still a pagan, is deeply concerned with the question of God's existence and with trying to establish the reasonableness of belief in God. Kind of a similar distinction to what he was making when he got in the controversy with the Thomists. His marriage to Helen ended in the late 1950s, and early 60s. He met Carolyn Pring. She was an editorial assistant to him at Britannica. They were working on a sort of a youth supplement to the Great Book Set. He was over 30 years older than she was, so that created some potential issues. Her parents had reservations about it, but they didn't object. Ultimately, Mortimer and Carolyn had two sons, Douglas and Philip, and they were baptized and ultimately confirmed in the Episcopal Church. And they lived in the Gold Coast neighborhood of Chicago and attended St. Chrysostom's Episcopal Church, and that's the church where Mortimer Adler's eventually his memorial service after his death, and Max Wiseman's as well, were both held there. So Father Robert Hall was the rector, And Adler says, Father Howell never raised the issue of Adler becoming a Christian. We're getting closer to the sermons. Father Howell is a friend of Father William Cassidy, and he was rector of Grace Episcopal Church, which is in downtown Chicago, not far away. And Carolyn Adler invited both of the priests to a party that she was giving for Mortimer. So at the party, she told the two priests that Adler criticized sermons he'd heard in Episcopal churches as they were traveling as not sufficiently theological and exegesis of the gospel text appointed in the liturgy of the day. Father Cassidy's response was to invite Adler to give a sermon at his church. And that was set for May 11th, 1980, which was Mother's Day. It's because of Father Cassidy that most of the typescripts of the sermons are preserved. I've talked to some about this in my earlier talk. Adler's papers, there's 154 boxes in the University of Chicago library. And just the folder list, you can generate a list of the folders if you go there at their website. And I tried, and there's a PDF option, and the PDF listing just the folders is over 150 pages. There's another 16 boxes at Syracuse University. He shows up at University of Texas at Austin, although from the look of it, it's sort of incidental that there are things about Adler in there, but he does show up when you do a search. But at the Lilly, that's the Eli Lilly family, the Lilly Library at Indiana University, there's a manuscript collection of Father Cassidy's. And most of that is a folder of these sermons. So the contrast here was this was new to me doing research of this type. I've done plenty of legal research, but research of this type. I'm at the University of Chicago Library, and it's high security. It's an archive. There's limits to what you can't have pens, you can't have Post-its because the adhesive, you can't have metal paper clips. This may be a standard, university archive procedure, but it was a little new to me. And you can only pre-order up to 10 boxes, which they will let you have one at a time. And you can't, it's what you can wear, and don't put your hands under the table. It's a little, I visited some, like minimum security prisons. It had some commonality there. So that was the contrast, is that at the center has accumulated a few, we had a few of these sermons from previous visits by Ken Zugan, our archivist. And so we copied out and had them scan and mail more from the University of Chicago. And it was a great, within all of the restrictions, they were very helpful and very professional. But the contrast just happened to be that Father Cassidy, who had Indiana connections, had donated these manuscripts, most of which is a folder with nothing but sermons in it. So I didn't go to Bloomington. I just said, can you send me a copy of that? That was nice. And included in that, I'll just get ahead a little bit here. These sermons went on at Father Cassidy's church in Chicago through the 80s. What it looks like happens is he retired back to his native Indiana, maybe semi-retired, and at Indianapolis, he had a conference and had invited Mortimer Adler to speak, and Adler gave 2 talks that I'll call sermons. The format and the topics are identical. Strictly speaking, they may not have been. And just for completeness here, he did give various talks, usually in Lent, at some churches, including his own St. Chrysostom's. But those were usually adapted from very directly from some of his books. So, if we had to make a line about what's a sermon and what's not, that's the line that I drew. The first sermon, that Mother's Day sermon, he says specifically that he's not using a text from the readings for that particular day, which there's the standard cycle of readings for each day of the liturgical year. And instead, he chose a passage that occurs in the general order of worship of the Episcopal Church. And that's, the typescript says, see quotation attached, which it is not. So, but the readings were easy enough to figure out. His summary, this is his first one, so he gives a brief summary of what he had to say. I tried to explain the relation between the Mosaic dialogue and Christ's two precepts of charity, from which Jesus said, hang all the law and the prophets. The title of my sermon was The Old Law and the New. And since it was delivered on Mother's Day, I gave special attention to the commandment about honoring thy father and thy mother, that the days of thy life may be long in the land of the Lord, in the land the Lord thy God giveth thee. Now, time is limited, so I don't know that I'm going to give much more of a summary of the other sermons beyond that. But I did note that it's first sermon and this topic of piety comes up. And again, that may at least have some significance to to Adler's thinking. The following year, he talked kind of generally on the topic religion and science. The text was from 2 Corinthians about the letter killeth, the spirit giveth life. And what he talked about was spiritual rather than literal meaning in interpreting scripture. It mentions, there's often, I'll call great books references. He talks here about Augustine hearing Ambrose preach and giving some exegesis on this. But examples would be in the Bible, there will be reference to the heavens, which is a spiritual concept, and to the heavens, the stars and such that we see in this material universe, or that our Father who art in heaven, well, that's a spiritual reference, not that the Father is somewhere in the distant cosmos. This one also has, and this comes up from time to time too, an aside. And the aside is about the lunatic fringe, the moral majority, which is a reference to, I guess, to early 1980s politics, but also as an indication of Adler's politics. He's I suppose he's many conservatives' favorite socialist. But he was, things do change over time, but he was, if he had to be pegged, he would be on the left. In May of '82, the sermon was on the image of God. And he begins with a distinction saying, and this can be a problem with the image of God, to remember that it's not anthropomorphic, it's deimorphic. Now is that one of his neologisms like ex-nihilation? I don't know. But in other words, man is made in God's image, although there is, obviously you hear things saying, no, we just make God in our image. And he gets into talking about, I'll say maybe the nature of the soul, bringing up writings by Descartes and Turing. And Turing, in the context of the test, could we get to the point where you could not tell if it was a human or a machine that you were communicating with? And Adler's theories here saying that our soul or our essence includes an immaterial factor that can't be simulated. And I think the contemporary thing now is, could we be part of a computer simulation from beings at some higher level? And that's actually, that's something I'm reading. You're reading this on the internet today. He's talking about this analogous point at that time. His prediction was that no machine will ever pass Turing's test. So at least he's not afraid of falsifiability. The 83 sermon was on, it's called St. Paul, the Greeks, and the Jews. As usual, it's not on the reading for the day. I'll give you a look here at how are we doing here?
That's fine.
Okay. Adler, as Ken Zugan said years ago, everything he wrote would be in this outline form, and the points would generally be one sentence. So he would just be literally reading the outline. If you type it up, you can pick that up sometimes when you're reading it in book text, but it was very rigorous. All right. St. Paul, the Greeks, and the Jews. Here's what he says in conclusion. I leave you with the question, does Christianity await a successor to St. Paul in order to become a truly universal religion? To break out of the mold of Greek secular wisdom, as St. Paul enabled it to become a Western religion by breaking out of the mold of Judaism's the mold of a Judaism's observance of the Mosaic law? Or, if that is not to happen, does Christianity's becoming a truly universal religion depend upon the triumph of Greek philosophical wisdom over all the other secular wisdoms of mankind? I don't know if that's a conference topic, Peter, but that's how he put it. Following year in March, he took a trip to Mexico, and this can happen. He got very ill and was hospitalized back in Chicago. And the hospitalization and illness caused him to become very depressed. His wife would visit him in the hospital, and he said he'd weep. And Father Howell, his pastor, visited and at his sickbed, prayed for his recovery. Adler says that he choked up and wept and recited the Lord's Prayer, the only prayer that he knew the words of. And on subsequent days, he prayed it over and over. That's after a few days of this, he says, when I was awake one night, a light dawned on me. I mean, it's figuratively, but still. So what happens here is it's sort of this, I don't know, almost kind of storybook conversion experience. It wasn't something that you might have said, well, somebody like Mortimer Adler won't have that. He'll have something different. But that was it. It was kind of when he goes from the God of the philosophers, and there's this leap of faith, and then he finds himself believing in God and praying to God. And so he arranged to be baptized April 21st of that year. That's my birthday, so I can remember that one. And his sermon that year, shortly after, was called Wisdom and Folly in Human Affairs. And the text was Psalm 111, verse 10. Fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And in this, he quotes Augustine to the effect that piety is the beginning of wisdom, and piety as synonymous with fear of the Lord. So again, that popped up, that's the foundation of this is piety, or at least a component of it. 1985, anyone remember Peter and Gordon? This must be a young group. This one is titled, they're not all titled. This one is titled Love in a World Without Sex. This one is also, and this may be common. He'd give the sermons in like May in Chicago, and then he would often give the sermon again at Christ Episcopal Church in Aspen. He'd be out at the Aspen Institute. This has a notation, something he talks about in the book, and it pops up a couple times in the sermons. He says his wife thinks that a sermon should be at least hortatory, if not inspirational. But Adler says he fears that his sermon will be only instructive. On a humidity index, they're generally as dry as Adler is generally. So if you take that from your own experience. But what he talks about is here there's the ambiguity or the different meanings of love, which we miss in English because that one word serves the purpose that in Latin or Greek were three different words. And so he says one way of clarifying that is just do this thought experiment of a world without sex, and then you take out the aspect of desire from love. And so what kind of love are you dealing with? On the issue of Adler and Catholicism, one thing that popped up, so to speak, is, this shows up in long footnotes in a couple of his books, was the issue of Catholic teaching on artificial contraception. And in the time of our lives, there's a long footnote, and I'll just quote it a little bit. We had the thing about it, consulting, going to the council of the quote from Aristotle on the soul, consulting those who have gone before us and so on and so forth. And that popped in my mind because of the consultation that he did here on this issue of Catholic teaching on contraception. Let me preface what I'm about to say by the observation that in my judgment, as in the judgment of leading liberal Catholic theologians, contraception is not a violation of the natural moral law. So, well, I'm not sure that's, I think he knew what answer he was going to get there. It just seemed odd that he said, well, I called up Bishop Sheen to just get another view or something like that. And then goes on, the official position of the Vatican rests on the factually false proposition that human sexuality is intended by nature to serve only one end, procreation. And that again is thinking, I think I was in Catholic school, 2 decades before this. It's like, no, I don't think that's right. I don't think there was any, I can't see that there was any question that Catholic teaching was that sex between married couples had both the procreative purpose and the purpose of their closeness, their physical closeness, and their as a way of means of their expression of their love for each other. And he seems, in some of these places here, he'll go in and he'll start relying on Aquinas, which he'd be very familiar with. But again, it seems odd to say that if you want to find out what Catholic teaching is, that you'll go read in Aquinas. I mean, theologians don't make doctrine. So that was odd. It was odd that apparently, despite the people, the Catholics in his circles of various kinds, that the same thing shows up in Desires Right and Wrong, which is published 21 years later. He covered a lot of the same ground and specifically says, I'm including this particular information. So I'm thinking, so no Catholic that he knew said, hey, I'm not sure about that, what you have in that footnote. And there's some Catholic sources that point out, for example, that that's not what the Catholic Catechism says. If you look back at the pertinent encyclicals, that's not quite it. He goes on and says, this was odd too, that he goes on from there to say that he thought you couldn't say that fornication, sex between unmarried people, violated the natural moral law. And then he gets into a long explanation, somewhat complex explanation, relying on Aquinas. And again, it's seemed like an odd place to be on that issue. Well then, with that prelude, in 1986, he gives a sermon. And in that one, he's talking about the Reformation, and specifically the issue of justification. And we get to, here's point 2 in his outline. Let me explain what I mean by saying that sound theology supports the Catholic doctrine concerning truth and works. I think he means there faith and works. And the argument is there's the three theological virtues. Charity is supernatural love. There's the 2 precepts of charity of love God, love your neighbor, and the distinction would be that faith with and without charity. But charity is the supernatural virtue by means of which we do good works, the acts that we do that benefit other human beings. So, he says, hence when St. James said that faith without charity is dead, he meant faith that does not express itself through charity in good deeds, loving acts toward our fellow human beings. So he says, so from what I've just said, in support of the text from St. James, it would appear that the Catholic position is correct. So I'm thinking, wait, I don't think as the waters of baptism in the Episcopal Church, just, I think it'd still be a little bit damp, and he comes out with this. He then goes on that there's a number of other issues not from the Reformation, but at that time that prevent unity. But it seemed odd to, here's somebody who's, people have been wondering for decades why he's not a Catholic. And then when we get to the issue of the Reformation, he just drops this in a sermon in an Episcopal church. Now, Episcopal church is a little different in the sense that it has sort of these, I guess I'll call it Anglo-Catholic high church and more Protestant low church. Which meaning, I think just terms high and low in terms of elaborate and so forth. But it just seemed surprising to me to find this in this context of Adler's whole progression here. Sometimes he gets a little off the track, I think. 1987, he's talking about rendering under Caesar, and gets off into this thing of, well, what does that mean in a republic? And he does talk about, you can make the analogies with, the participation you should have in church, the participation you should have in civic life. And again, this may be a product of the times, but he's talking about some apparently proposals at the time, for example, that every American should be carrying a card where they've signed, where they agree to support the principles of the Constitution. I'm not sure that would even be constitutional. This 88, he talks about the seventh deadly sin, and this is based on the parable of the talents, which is usually regarded as partly a parable against, he said you could be against greed or rent seeking, but he says, given the way the parable works out, that it's really about sloth. And the reason that sloth is significant, because if you're slothful, you're not loving, and your obligation, I mean, the 2 commandments are to love, and that sloth is a form of that, of withholding love. 89, it's Father's house has many mansions. Here, one thing was that he talked about a couple of modern interpretations of that, which he rejected. He said, now again, I guess these would be in some broad sense liberal theologians or liberal writers in religion, but he thought they were, if they're trying to make this into an argument for religious pluralism, they're just stretching the text unreasonably. But he did say what he said in other contexts, that religious truth, and I think this is maybe what these other writers were doing, religious truth, he says, is not a kind of poetic truth, which would be, if it was a poetic truth, you could reconcile various very different belief systems. But he says, no, it has to be, religious truth has to be compatible with the truth of science and the truth of philosophy. There is truth. There's a unity of truth. And that's a position he's taken elsewhere in his writings. 1990, I don't find a sermon. Now, it may just be a gap in what we've been able to find. That was the year that the second edition of the Great Books of the Western World was published. He may have been tied up with that. It's not something that he talks about. 91 was the year he went down to Indianapolis to give these two talks. But again, they're in form, they're identical to his sermons. The one on heaven, this goes back to something he said earlier, just stressing that heaven is a spiritual, not a material place. It's distinct from the heavens, for example, as described in Genesis. And he goes on that some things that, what should be literal, kingdom, for example, my kingdom come is, or thy kingdom come is not literal in the Lord's Prayer, in the sense that of setting up a political establishment or restoring the kingdom of Israel or something like that. The descending and ascending in the creed, he also says is figurative in this sense. And I'm not sure if that's something that every Christian denomination will hold, that it's not completely figurative, but that's the way he sometimes will talk about these things, as in that sense. Or he said that heaven is not up or out, it's other. Again, stressing the spiritual aspect. The other one in 91 that he gave in Indianapolis was on the Golden Rule. And this has this, what he said in the Time of Our Lives, his book, which is that the Golden Rule, well, there's no real content there other than it's a reciprocal relationship, but it doesn't really tell you what's good. So it could be, it conceivably could be anything. He gets into his idea of how you would determine what's objectively really good, and that's what we should do for each other. Second to last, there's one called Sin, Original and Otherwise, and that he talks about, my Latin is quite rusty, but O felix culpa, O happy fault. It talks about original sin and the need for redemption, and puts it in the sense that, and this is my interpretation, it seems a little strange, but maybe it's not as strange as it's seeming to me, but the idea that the original sin was necessary in the sense that it made a redeemer needed in order to then to heal and elevate our nature. And I can remember, hearing this song, I think at the Easter Vigil, and it's like, okay. The last one that we have here is just one on prayer. And there he makes the distinction between prayer, and he and his wife had this discussion. He said that prayer is an expression of love and obedience. It's not asking for something. And his wife said, sure it is. And for example, the Lord's Prayer is a lot of asking, actually. And so his wife won that argument. It's not a sermon, but we do have a text. He was on National Public Radio's program Talk of the Nation in 1994. That would have been, he was just about completely retired. And he talked, the topic was honor thy father and thy mother. And I think it was seeing this and putting this together that kind of thought that there's that undercurrent of piety throughout these various aspects of his career that may tie these things together. Well, Carolyn Adler died March 9th of 1998. And at that time, Mortimer Adler would have been, let me do that math here, 96 or so. So I said 30 years old. Okay, he's actually like 34, 35 years older than Carolyn. So here you marry somebody 34, 35 years younger than you, and then you outlive her. One of those things. I suspect neither one of them saw that coming until the end here. By that time, they had moved out to San Mateo, California. That's where Carolyn's family was, and well, I don't know. I understand that Mortimer died quite peacefully, about as good as you might want. But before that happened, he was received into the Catholic Church in December 1999. That first came out when D.L. Hudson published it in Crisis Magazine, and that was in 2000. Adler was still alive at that point. In 2007, Hudson also went on to reveal that he had heard it from Bishop Pierre Dumaine of San Jose, which is sort of the diocese next door to San Mateo. So the sermons, they give us some additional insight into Adler. It looks to me as though I'm sure he did some research, but I think he largely relied on his vast reading. He was very familiar with a lot of these texts. And as far as a question that, I have to say too that Tim Lacey wrote a long article posted online at Religion in U.S. History, and he covers a lot of this same ground about the biographical stuff. Didn't have access to all the sermons, but he said he was kind of puzzled about exactly why Adler delayed so long to become a Christian, and why he didn't become a Catholic when he was kind of thinking about it, 60 years before. I can't see any reason other than the circumstances, what Adler's given. That doesn't mean, that there aren't things that we're not aware of, but looking at it, Adler was an extraordinary man in a lot of ways, but his motivations here all seem ordinary. And he was, his wives were committed to the church. They wanted their children baptized. And as a pagan, he didn't have an objection in principle. He wasn't anti-religious. And once that wasn't there, it seemed, then what may have been there all, what this desire that was there all along, or this tendency, now why not? Carolyn's gone, it's not going to hurt anyone in that sense. Might as well. But on the other hand, he didn't become a Christian earlier either. Max Weismann, who knew him, I never met Adler, Max Weismann, who knew him, was quoted as saying about Adler when this happened that he was always a Catholic at heart. And I'll defer to his judgment. I don't know that that's, obvious from the paper record. Maybe if you knew him personally, like Max did, maybe it is. Sure.
Did Adler ever soften his belief and hope that there should be a world government, a world federation after World War II?
Yeah.
American
No,
perpetuate peace. We needed a world government.
I don't think so. When we were talking about that, and when we read, I'm sorry, I can't think of the title. No, he didn't. And the argument was sovereignty is what keeps order within our societies. And so world sovereignty would keep international order. And it seemed to me that a potential issue there was Adler seemed to be talking about the issue of like, well, what about civil wars? And he seemed to be thinking in terms of, okay, yeah, well, if a civil war broke out in the Ukraine, this world government would take care of it in short order. And I'm not sure that he was really thinking in terms of, no, what if there was a worldwide civil war? What then? And because it doesn't seem to explain why. He's saying, well, it's not, that wouldn't be any worse than what we have now. And what we don't have, maybe the world wars were world civil wars, really. But that would be the point, is that would it be any harder, would this actually prevent that?
Maybe you had in mind, well, Hitler started small and grew. The Japanese started small.
Yeah.
Stopped this.
Well, yeah. And, I'm getting into the merits of it. But no, as far as I can tell, he remained, he didn't find any convincing reason to back away from that belief, as far as I can see.
Barry?
Yeah.
I may have a bit of an answer for why Adler put on so late in life to take a serious look at becoming Christian or Catholic. When people say today, they say, I just see older people at church today. And so that makes sense because they're family confinement. I think the reason Adler probably got serious about church later in life was simply he was striving for finance.
You know what that makes me think of is there's that old expression, every time and this may be a Catholic piety, but every time I pass a church, I stop and make a visit. So when they wheel my coffin in, the Lord won't ask, who is it? But Adler had been in church all the time already, even though he wasn't a Christian. So maybe he figured he'd sort of slip through there.
Well, one part of being a Christian. It's the hardest part. You have to be holy. It's not philosophical.
I have a question for Paul. And regarding the St. John Paul II with respect to the Aquinas reason and metaphysics, more or less being at the top of the Charitarians who worship and so on. Will, right? Does he identify anything with Schaefer? No, he identifies lawyers.
Sure.
Psychologists. Psychologists. It's not him, it's my interpretation. Because, no.
Okay.
It's too fast. But probably yes, but not directly. Because a part of his work deals with psychology.
Right.
Deals with psychology, but he does not name, the function of psychologists in the society. But there is an interesting movement among philosophers now, because in Poland, many of them, they transform themselves to being psychologists. A friend of mine, he commuted from Lublin to Krakow just to finish studies, to become an expert, a trainer, because there is a need.
Now, what I see in here, aside from the Charitarian, two horses, is Plato's divided line. And also the tripart division of the soul according to Averroes. Where the whole of truth is contained in the Quran, but only, Aristotle seems to know how to read the Quran. And I'm wondering whether or not there's not a metaphysicism in the Pope's understanding, because it appears that only the metaphysician apprehends existence. But the apprehension of existence, for example, there's truth in physical science, and it's not metaphysical truth. And according to St. Thomas, you apprehend truth in terms of the intellect and other faculties cooperating, and the original awareness of truth, as Joseph points out, it's not, the intellect doesn't apprehend it, strictly speaking, but it's abstractly considered, and the senses don't apprehend it, it's the person who apprehends it. So if you're kind of maintaining that the metaphysics is reason that puts you in touch with the existence of things, you run the danger of a metaphysicism where, just like for Averroes, it's only the Aristotelians, be in touch with reality, and it's the intellect. It's a kind of intellectualism.
It is it's difficult to answer for him because he presupposes metaphysics.
Right.
It is not that he is a metaphysician. He always says that what he does is developing, is supplementing, is going around and looking for a job for himself, just to provide anything further.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that for him, especially it infers from the Fides et Ratio, that what we need is a tool to arrive at ultimate truth. So this is, I think, where metaphysics should work,
Right.
to help us to arrive to ultimate truth, because all the encyclical letter is dedicated to putting together reason and faith.
Yeah, well, I think it's dinner time.
Very good.
But anyway, that's a good line. Yeah.